This is my survival RPG. I've been working on this project in the Godot engine for the past few weeks, with the goal of setting up a foundation for a small game that's easy to create content for. For any Godot users, you probably know the engine's most well-known workflow is the node system, which allows you to create custom objects and scenes with basic building blocks, like sprites and physics objects. However, for this project, I've decided to take a less conventional approach and utilize the unsung hero of Godot development, resources. The reason resources are so great is that you can put anything in them, even other resources, and save them for later. Need a list of items and descriptions for the player's inventory? Make a resource. Do you need to save all the stats of a monster in one place? You can use a resource for that too. Do you want to save all the data you just stored in an easy-to-get format so you can load up Blade? Again, that's a job for resources. The few basic types of resources in my game are terrains and entities. Terrains store data, like what picture they'll display and if the player can walk over it. The world is set up, so there's a two-dimensional array containing all of the generated terrain, and accessing it is like playing Battleship. At any point you can ask the world what terrain is an X row and a Y column. As you might imagine, this comes in handy for many things. Entities are handled in a different way. They are pretty similar to terrain, except they know what position they occupy, and have things like stats and inventory. Instead of having another grid to store entities in the world, it has a regular list that keeps track of all of the monsters, NPCs, and other interactive objects in the world. When the world creates an entity, it simply scans for an empty spot in that list and then plops the entity resource in. You may notice that even though I said I'm not using nodes, that I've got a pretty full scene where the game is run. This is because for the actual game logic I'm using resources and scripts, but for representing this data to the player, I default to using Godot's built-in methods. Remember when I said accessing terrain was like playing Battleship? The script that controls the tile map takes full advantage of that design, and asks the world for every row and every column in that terrain grid, one at a time. Once it has the terrain data, it can access the picture that the terrain is set to display and place it on the map. I used to have it set up so that the entities were placed in much the same way, but that made the movement look very choppy. Instead, I chose to take a risk and do something I had never done before at the time. Instead of using tiles, I made a special sprite object that would synchronize with the world's entity list. The code for this checks through all of the entities in the world, and checks if one of those special sprite objects already exists to represent said entity. If there's a sprite object that doesn't have a matching entity, it gets deleted automatically. These objects are also given the index of the entity they represent, so they can automatically go to the appropriate place in the world, and display the correct graphic. I've mentioned entities having inventories before, and as you may have guessed it, item storage is a resource too. It works in the same way that the world stores entities. Inventories have two lists. One stores all the item resources that the entity has, and the other stores how much of that item is present. Besides a few helper functions to deal with item management, that's it. Hi, this is Undergrowth, from the future. I want to drop by and ask you to like and subscribe to this video, so I can grow this channel and show more projects to you down the line. Thanks for listening. I'll get you back to the video. Items themselves are also pretty simplistic because they don't actually do anything by themselves. Item effects are handled by giving an item resource an ID. The script that handles these effects can take an integer, and based on what it gets, it executes an effect on the world, like printing, "This is a test item effect," or dealing some damage to an entity. The hard part of this was making the UI for letting the player actually use their items. The menu has an inventory tab that populates itself with buttons for every item in the player's inventory, which took longer to code than I'd like to admit. Once the player selects an item, the UI grabs the effect ID out of the player's inventory and passes it to the script that handles the effects. If the item is meant to be used on another entity, like a weapon or a potion, the game enters a targeting mode. The next entity that is selected is also passed to the effects handler, along with the ID, and the player's terrible wrath is inflicted upon the unsuspecting entity. Besides basic item implementation, weapons aren't quite coded all the way yet. In this state, weapons have no range, fixed damage, or anything else that makes fighting actually interesting. Weapons will probably inherit from an item resource, with features like this implemented. Upon not having range, base damage, and damage type all be adjustable values, as well as being able to configure the weapon to consume other items as ammo. This is all a pretty good start, but this game is far from finished. I've implemented things like pathfinding and visibility as well, but things like enemy AI, the player death and respawn system, as well as any sort of dialogue functionality, still feels so far away from where I am now. Even though I'm using an engine to make my game, it's like I'm programming another, separate engine on top of it. While this gives me a lot more control as a programmer and a designer, it also takes much longer to write. Despite these disadvantages, I still think using resources is the way to go. It may even be possible that in the future making mods will be greatly streamlined due to this type of design. In the future, I'd like to implement enemy monsters as well as harmless NPCs to talk and trade with, and maybe quest functionalities to round the interaction off. The world generation isn't done either. I still need to implement biome generation along with having basic structures be built when the world is made. I'm planning to have entity drops on death so you can gain items and craft new equipment, which will leave the players plenty of new ways to progress and explore. This directly ties in with traversal items that I talked about earlier. As for the story, I don't have anything definite, but I have a vague idea that the game will take place in a world where most people live in small caverns under the ground, and related elements like heat vents, crystals, etc. make up the technology and magic of the people that live there. The working title is Undergrowth, but that might change in the future. It depends on how it's received. The art is also a placeholder. I'm using Kenny assets at the moment, but at some point I will swap them out and try and establish a more unique art style. I'm looking forward to developing and sharing this game with everyone. This has been Drifter. Thanks for watching.